Birthday. What a deceptive word. All my life, that date meant laughter, hands on my shoulders, heartfelt hugs, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the kitchen. It meant the people I loved gathering to remind me that life was worth living. But that day, that damn day, the silence was so profound it seemed to carry weight. 78 years aren't erased from anyone's memory. However, those I loved most found a way to do so. That morning I got up before dawn. The old farmer's habit is not lost even if the fields are no longer yours. I poured myself a cup of coffee that tasted more of habit than flavor. Outside, the March air was fresh, with that scent of damp earth that always brought back memories of harvest days. I sat in the old deck chair, the same one that creaks every time someone sits down, as if protesting the weight of another burden. The pocket watch I inherited from my father rested in my hand. I opened and closed it several times, listening to the dry click. Not a message, not a call, nothing. My eyes fell upon the photographs on the table. There I was, young and strong, next to Elena, my wife, with her smile that lit up any room, and our children, Daniel and Lucia, young, their clothes covered in dust and overflowing with joy. Those days seemed like another life. I ran my fingers over the frame as if by touching it I could return there even for a moment. They say the hardest loneliness is the one that finds you on days that should be festive. I would add something else. It hurts more when that loneliness was chosen by others. It wasn't a forgetfulness. It wasn't a confusion. It was a calculated silence, determined by some conversation I wasn't part of. For weeks I'd noticed shifty glances, curt answers, excuses. "We're busy, Dad. We'll talk later." Naively, I thought it was just the rhythm of their lives. But that day, I understood it wasn't that. I understood that something had broken and that the rift had left me out. I took a deep breath. The cold air entered my lungs as if trying to wake me from a long sleep. Outside, the trees swayed slowly, oblivious to the loneliness of an old man sitting with a lukewarm coffee and a lifetime of work behind him. I thought about getting up, about doing anything to avoid feeling that emptiness. But I didn't. I stayed there staring at the horizon, letting the silence tell me everything my children didn't dare say. And then I knew. That birthday would be different. There would be no cake, no candles, no voices singing my name. There would only be me, my shadow, and the bitter certainty that my family had abandoned me. It was at that moment that an idea began to grow inside me. Slowly but surely. An idea that would change everything. I've always considered myself a simple man. I was born and raised in the countryside, among fields that knew no rest and a sky that seemed bigger than any dream. From a young age, I learned that life doesn't wait. If it rains, you sow. If the sun is shining, you harvest quickly before everything is lost. My father used to say that the earth doesn't reward the lazy, and I've carried that with me all my life, in my work, in my family, in every decision I've made. When I met Elena, she was only 22 years old and had a heart full of promise. She had a sweet nature but the strength of an ancient tree trunk that withstood every storm. We built our house with our own hands. Every brick, every nail, every wall painted by us. There we began raising our children, Daniel and Lucia, and I believed that with love and effort, nothing could bring us down. But life has a cruel way of testing certainties. First came the drought that wiped out half the harvest. Then came the accident that left my leg permanently scarred and forced me to slow down. And finally, the illness that took Elena from me a little over 10 years ago. Since then, my children became my only reason to get up every day. I did what I could to be there. I helped them with whatever they needed, took care of my grandchildren and fixed things around their houses, even when my leg hurt. Over time, I began to notice that my visits were getting shorter and shorter, and my calls were increasingly ignored. There was always a, "Dad, I'm busy. Talk to you later." I attributed it to the hustle and bustle of life. I never imagined it was a harbinger of something bigger, something that would leave me alone on the very day I should have felt most loved. And that's why that anniversary wasn't just a forgotten day. It was a silent message. A message without words, but with a weight impossible to ignore. A few weeks before my birthday, I noticed something strange was happening. The conversations that had previously flowed naturally became cold and rushed. When I called Daniel, he answered impatiently as if counting the seconds until he could hang up. Lucia, on the other hand, almost always let my calls go to voicemail and then sent a short message. "Sorry, Dad, I'm busy." At first I tried to convince myself it was just modern life. I'd always heard that today's world sucks up people's time. But there was something different. Something in their eyes when we met, as if everyone was having a conversation except me. Once I overheard a whisper between Daniel and his wife, Clara. She said something like, "We can't go on like this." And he quickly replied, "We'll sort it out later." When I got closer, they changed the subject. Small exclusions also began to appear. A barbecue at Lucia's house to which they forgot to invite me. A family meeting to discuss the sale of a piece of land that was decided without my presence, even though it belonged to Elena and me. These wounds seemed small, but they accumulated like stones in the pocket of a man who was already walking with difficulty. I particularly remember one Sunday. I had made empanadas like I did when the children were little, and waited until the afternoon to see if anyone would show up. No one did. I ate alone, saving the portions I planned to give them. The next day, when I took them to Lucia's, she didn't even open the door. She just said through the crack, "Thanks, Dad, but I'm leaving. I can't talk." These moments began to consume me. I kept trying to believe there was no intention, but an inner voice told me otherwise. And as my birthday approached, I realized my children weren't planning anything. Not a single mention, no preparation, just silence. A silence that spoke volumes to me more than any words could. The day before my birthday, I went out early to buy bread and candles. Not because I was expecting a party, but out of habit. For many years, Elena would wake me up with the table set, coffee brewed, and a simple cake with crooked candles, which we always lit together. I thought that even without her, I could maintain the custom. Maybe, just maybe, my children would arrive as a surprise. I passed by the street where Daniel lives. The curtains were closed, but there were cars in the driveway. I thought about knocking, but decided against it. I didn't want to force a visit, especially the day before my birthday. On my way back, I ran into a neighbor who said indifferently, "I saw your children yesterday at the supermarket, buying a lot of meat. Looks like they have visitors." I smiled to myself, saying nothing, but inside I felt a pang. They were buying meat for others, not for me. At night, the silence in the house seemed thicker than ever. I stared at the walls, marked by time, each crack carrying a story. Elena's painting, painted by a friend decades before, seemed to stare back at me sadly. "They've forgotten you, Ernesto," I thought, and that sentence hurt even more because it seemed true. I tried to distract myself by cleaning my father's pocket watch. He always said a clean watch was a sign that its owner still cared about time. But at that moment, I started to wonder if he still had time for them, or if they'd already decided I no longer belonged. I went to bed late, with the wind beating against the windows and my heart heavy. That night I dreamed of Elena. She was on the porch, beckoning me to sit, as she often did. But when I went to her, the chair next to her was empty. I woke before dawn, feeling that the dream was a warning. My birthday dawned gray, with low clouds that seemed to carry the weight of my own chest. I made strong coffee and sat on the porch, as usual. My pocket watch read 7 when I realized I hadn't received a single happy birthday, not even a quick text. I checked my phone several times, like a child waiting for a promised call, but the screen was still blank. Around 9 o'clock, I decided to call Lucia. She answered in a hurried voice, "Dad, I'm in the middle of something. I'll call you later, okay?" And he hung up before I could answer. I felt a void fill my stomach, not from hunger, but from abandonment. So I decided to try to contact Daniel. He didn't answer. Minutes later, a short message appeared. "Congratulations, Dad. Talk to you later." I read and reread those words. Dry, empty, like someone fulfilling an obligation out of courtesy. There was no love in them, no desire to share the moment. As I wondered what I'd done to deserve this, I heard laughter and music in the distance. I recognized the address. It was Daniel's house. I stood still, listening to the echo of joy that didn't include me. With each laugh, it was as if someone were knocking on the door of my chest, just to remind me that I was alone. I didn't cry. Perhaps because tears had already abandoned me years ago, or perhaps because the pain was so deep that I couldn't find an outlet in my eyes. I simply stood there, staring into the distance, trying to understand when my children stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as a burden. The hours passed slowly, as if the day insisted on reminding me, minute by minute, that I no longer had a place in their lives. At noon, I prepared a simple meal: rice, a piece of chicken, and salad. I sat at the table and instinctively placed 2 extra pieces of cutlery, just as I had done when Elena was alive and expecting her children. I looked at those empty spaces and felt a lump in my throat. I ended up eating slowly, without savoring the flavor, as if each bite were merely a bodily obligation, not a pleasure. I remembered other birthdays, my children's little hands bringing flowers from the garden, the strong hugs, the laughter that filled the house. Now it all seemed like part of a story I'd told myself to believe they loved me. After lunch, I sat on the porch. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, but the cold wind prevented any attempt at warmth. I looked toward the gate and imagined for a moment seeing them come in, with a shy smile and a makeshift cake. But it didn't happen. There was no car, no footsteps, no voices calling me. It was in that absolute silence that something inside me completely broke. It wasn't just sadness, but the knowledge that to them I was no longer part of the family. It was a persistent memory, a weight they were slowly shedding. And as I sat there, pocket watch in hand, I knew my life was about to change, perhaps forever. That afternoon, still my birthday, I stared at the horizon until the light began to change and the chill of night approached. It was at that moment that the sadness transformed into something more. It wasn't pure rage, nor a blind desire for revenge. It was a clarity, as if I had finally understood the game. They didn't want me there anymore, but they didn't have the courage to say it out loud either. They preferred to slowly remove me from their lives until I silently disappeared. I decided that if they wanted silence, they would have it, but not as they imagined. It wouldn't be me, alone and forgotten, who would be erased. It would be a planned silence with a purpose that would leave questions and discomfort in the air. The next day, I began to observe more closely. I noticed how rarely Daniel appeared, always in a hurry, avoiding entering the house. I noticed when he looked away so as not to meet mine. I remembered the times he had asked for my signature to fix some papers and how he had avoided explaining what they were for. I began mentally compiling every detail, every random phrase, every hurried visit. I also remembered a rumor that had been circulating around town for months. Someone mentioned that Daniel and Lucia were trying to sell part of an old family plot of land. At the time, I thought it was impossible. That land had been purchased with years of hard work, and after Elena's death, I swore it would only be sold if it benefited everyone. Now, with everything that was happening, that memory took on new strength. That night, before going to sleep, I took a wooden box from under the bed. Inside were documents, letters, and some old records of the family's estate and accounts. As I leafed through each piece of paper, I realized that perhaps they held the key to understanding what they were really doing, and who knows, to deciding what I would do next. I spent the entire night sorting through papers I'd saved for decades: certificates, deeds, old receipts, even bank letters Elena and I had archived. Each page contained a fragment of our lives, and as I read, I realized my children probably had no idea all of this was still in my hands. I found the deed to the oldest piece of land, the one my father had bought and then transferred to me. The document clearly stated that any sale required my signature, but something caught my attention. Among my belongings were recent copies of my documents, stolen without my authorization. I remembered that, months earlier, Daniel had asked me to sign update documents for the bank. At the time, I trusted him and signed without reading. Now, a nagging doubt was beginning to grow. I decided to consult with an old friend, Arturo, who worked at the civil registry. The next day, I went there with a briefcase under my arm. Arturo greeted me with that firm handshake known only to locals. I asked him to find out if there were any recent lawsuits related to my properties. He looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern, but agreed. As I consulted the records, I felt the weight of waiting. And then came the answer I'd been dreading. Indeed, there was a document for the sale of the land, and my signature was there. But it wasn't recent. Arturo noticed my reaction and said quietly, "Ernesto, that signature was stuck on. This is a forgery." My blood ran cold. The abandonment on my birthday wasn't an emotional neglect. It was part of something bigger, something calculated. They didn't just want to push me away. They wanted to erase me from everything, even from what I had built with my own hands. I left the notary's office with heavy legs, as if each step carried the weight of disappointment. It wasn't just the terrain. If Daniel and Lucia dared to forge my signature, what else would they be capable of? The cold breeze outside seemed to mock me, carrying the familiar scent of the city I had helped build, but which now treated me like a stranger. I came home and laid out all the documents on the table. I spent hours examining every detail, every date, every stamp. I found bank records showing cash withdrawals from my account, made on the same days Daniel came to visit. I also noticed that some bills were being paid late, even though I had left enough money to cover them. It was as if, little by little, they were undermining my financial security, paving the way for them to see me as incapable of taking care of myself. I remembered the strange conversations, the glances they exchanged. Perhaps they were already planning to put me in a place reserved for adults, away from everything and everyone. This made me clench my fists. Anger gripped me intensely, but it was soon replaced by an icy calm, the same calm a hunter feels before setting a trap. I decided not to confront anyone yet. Silence this time would be my ally. I needed to know exactly how far they were willing to go. I needed to find out who else was involved and how I could turn the tables without them noticing. And above all, I needed to protect what little I had left before it was too late. I opened the closet, took out my old leather briefcase and began organizing it. I put all the important documents in order. I attached certified copies, keeping the originals in a place only I knew. It wouldn't be easy to get rid of them, not without facing the consequences. In the following days, I continued with my routine as if nothing had happened. I greeted the neighbors, went to the supermarket, and tended the small garden in front of my house. Inside, however, every step was calculated. I no longer looked at my children as I had before. Now I watched them as if studying an opponent, gauging movements, noting patterns. I started recording everything. I saved all the messages they sent me, noting their visiting times, what they said, and even their tone of voice. Years of working the land had taught me to recognize the signs before a storm, and those signs were everywhere. Daniel came less and less, and when he did appear, he brought vague conversations about what's best for you and making things easier for everyone. Lucia, on the other hand, tried to be more subtle, asking me if I'd ever considered selling that property that takes so much work. That's when I decided to visit the bank in person. I didn't feel like making calls. I wanted to see the documents in person. I arrived early, before the branch opened, and waited. When I finally got a call, I asked for a detailed account statement for the past 2 years and a copy of all the authorizations issued in my name. The employee hesitated, but recognizing my name in the old records, she called the manager. He, a man who had known me for decades, greeted me seriously and handed me the documents. There it was. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, unjustified cash withdrawals, and, worst of all, authorizations signed in what I supposedly called my handwriting. My stomach churned. I stuffed everything into the leather briefcase without a word. The manager looked at me and said quietly, "Ernesto, I think you should talk to a lawyer. This isn't right." I left the bank without responding. I already knew it wasn't right. The question was, how could I act without them realizing I already knew everything? I walked home slowly, not out of tiredness, but to gather my thoughts. The cold evening wind reminded me that time was passing and that every day I was late could be an opportunity for them to move forward with their plan. When I arrived, I left the leather folder on the table and carefully reopened each document. I spent hours reviewing them, marking every suspicious point with a red pencil. Dates, signatures, amounts. It was like putting together a dark puzzle that, in the end, would reveal the true face of my own family. I remembered Arturo from the notary's office and decided he would be my first ally. The next day I returned with some documents. Arturo examined each page carefully and confirmed what I feared. There was a clear pattern of forgery and manipulation. "Ernesto, this is serious and you can't let it go," he told me. But I knew it wasn't enough to report him. I had to be prepared for the counterattack. My children wouldn't hesitate to spin the story, to portray me as a confused old man who no longer knew what he was signing. It was at that moment that I began to plan something bigger. I needed to gather irrefutable evidence, but also create a way out, a path that would allow me to disappear before they noticed. It wouldn't be a fearful escape, but a strategic and calculated retreat, so that by the time they realized I was gone, it would already be too late. That night I sat on the porch with my pocket watch in my hands. I listened to it ticking as if marking the beginning of a countdown. Inside, the leather briefcase rested on the table, bearing the weight of all the truth my children never imagined I would discover. And there, under the starry sky, I decided I wouldn't wait for them to come looking for me. I would choose the moment to leave myself. The day after my decision, I woke up before dawn. The coffee was more bitter than usual, but I didn't need flavor. I needed clarity. I looked around my house, every corner steeped in memories, and realized that part of the plan would be to let go. If I wanted to disappear without a trace, I needed to get rid of everything that might betray my fate. I started with the back workshop. I only kept a few tools with sentimental value. My father's hammer, the wrench I used to fix my first truck, the knife Elena sharpened for slicing bread. I organized the rest into boxes to sell discreetly. I wouldn't leave anything for Daniel and Lucia to use as an excuse to come look after my things. In the following days, I started leaving home early, always carrying my leather briefcase over my shoulder. I went to a nearby town where no one knew me and opened a bank account. I transferred some of the money I still had under my control there, in installments, so as not to attract attention. At the same time, I started keeping cash in a secret compartment of the old suitcase Elena used when we visited relatives. I also met with a lawyer Arturo recommended. I told him only part of the story, enough to officially register my will not to sell any property or transfer anything without my physical presence. He looked me in the eye and said, "Your children aren't going to like this." I smirked. They don't have to like it. They just have to respect it. Every step I took was calculated to strengthen me without arousing suspicion. And little by little, I began to feel myself regaining control. With my account secured and my lawyer informed, I began to consider my physical departure. Disappearing didn't just mean leaving, but doing so in a way no one could predict. I began visiting places outside the city, pretending I was just sightseeing, but in reality, evaluating potential destinations. I avoided main roads, asked few questions, and observed a lot. At the same time, I kept up the drama at home. I answered Daniel and Lucia's infrequent calls with the same tired voice as always, responding infrequently, making them believe I was increasingly isolated and weakened. This image would help me when I finally disappeared. They would think I had simply given up, or ended up in a nursing home without warning. I also contacted an old acquaintance, Miguel, who worked in freight transport. I told him I needed to take some belongings to a distant relative and asked him to keep them for a while. No questions asked. Miguel, loyal as ever, agreed. I gave him boxes of clothes, tools, and some documents I didn't want to keep at home. Meanwhile, I started leaving little false clues. I visited a nursing home in another city, asked about vacancies, and even got a flyer. I knew that when my children noticed I was gone, someone would eventually tell me that old Ernesto had been there asking to stay. It was part of my game, to divert them from my true destiny. With each passing day, the weight on my shoulders lessened, and the coldness in my thoughts deepened. I wasn't just running away. I was laying the groundwork so that, when they finally contacted me, they wouldn't know where to start. As my children carried on with their lives, convinced I was becoming increasingly weak and isolated, I fine-tuned the final details of my plan. With each visit from Daniel, I noticed the same pattern. He'd rush in, ask vague questions about my paperwork, and hint that maybe it was time to put things in order. I pretended not to understand, responding with stories from the past or straying into trivial matters. The more distracted I seemed, the more he believed he was in control. Lucia, on the other hand, tried the path of false concern. One afternoon, she brought me a cake to brighten my day and kept asking me if I wanted to reduce my responsibilities and rest without worries. I smiled, thanked her for the cake, and secretly made another mental note. They were speeding up the process. It was during this period that I decided to take a risk. I invited them to lunch, saying I wanted to talk about the future. I chose a date and prepared a dish they'd loved since they were children, beef and potato stew prepared just as Elena had taught me. As I cooked, I knew this table would be the setting for more than just a lunch. It would be a time to test how far they were willing to go. When they arrived, I immediately sensed the tension. Few words, exchanged glances, and anxiety disguised as attentiveness. I let them speak first, and as expected, they launched into a conversation about my quality of life and my safety. I simply listened, slowly stirring the stew, as if each movement were a beat to the music I already knew by heart. As they spoke, I realized they were no longer concerned with hiding their true intentions. Daniel, in a measured tone, suggested that I consider selling the house and land to make everyone's life easier. Lucia, in a gentler tone, added that then I could move to a more comfortable place with proper care. The words were polite, but the venom was present, dissolved in every syllable. I didn't respond immediately. I stood up, went to the shelf, and picked up the old pocket watch. I held it for a few seconds, feeling the cold weight of the metal. I placed it on the table right in the center, between the three of us, and said, "That watch belonged to my father. He endured wars, debts, and poor harvests. But he always returned to the family, because honor is not for sale." They looked at each other, perhaps unsure whether it was a metaphor or a direct negative. Then I stared at them and added, "The house, the land, everything I built with Elena will follow the same path. It's not for sale, not in my lifetime." A thick silence filled the room. Daniel fiddled with his napkin, and Lucia forced an awkward smile. I served the stew and we ate in silence, but I could feel her frustration growing with every spoonful. When they left, I closed the door and watched them walk away. I knew this conversation wouldn't make them give up. On the contrary, it might accelerate their plans. And that was exactly what I wanted, for them to believe they still had a chance while I prepared my final exit. After that lunch, I realized that time had sped up for them. A few days later, Daniel returned alone with a folder, saying he needed my signature just to resolve some matters at the notary's office. I smiled and asked him to leave the papers with me so I could read them calmly. He insisted, trying to convince me it was urgent, but I stood my ground. "If it's urgent, bring it to me tomorrow. I'm not signing anything today," I replied, looking him straight in the eyes. The next day, before he showed up, I put the first part of my silent departure into practice. I took my suitcase to Miguel's house, along with some original documents and the money I had set aside. I asked him to keep everything safe and not tell anyone. He, as always, simply nodded and said, "Trust me, Ernesto." At home, I deliberately left some signs of abandonment: an overdue bill on the table, newspapers piled in a corner, the door ajar. I wanted them to feel I was losing control when they returned, that my absence was just another natural stage of this imagined decline. At the end of that week, I made my last visit to the local bank. I withdrew the remaining money in my name and closed the account. I left with the envelope in my pocket and a strange feeling. It was like pulling out the last root that had tied me to that earth. When I got home, I sat on the porch, pocket watch in hand and my suitcase already hidden. The next step would be to disappear. And when that happened, every memory, every suspicion, and every regret my children carried would become part of my calculated silence. The path I chose seemed to take me away from everything, and for a while, that's exactly how I felt. Every mile took me further from home, from the memories, from the voices that hurt me. But when night fell and silence took hold, I realized something was still there, clinging to my soul. It wasn't anger, but it wasn't peace either. I had planned to disappear, to start a new life, far from everyone, and in a way, I succeeded. The small town welcomed me wholeheartedly. The rented room gave me shelter, and I could walk around without anyone knowing my name. However, inside there was a void that neither time nor distance could fill. It was one of those nights, sitting on the small porch, that I heard a strange sound. It wasn't the distant crowing of a rooster, nor the rustling of trees. It was a group of voices singing, coming from a simple church down the street. I didn't know why, but my feet decided to take me there. The church was small, with pale walls and weather-worn wooden pews. The open windows let in the sound of a simple but lively choir. I stood at the door, not daring to enter. A woman saw me there and smiled, beckoning me closer. I entered slowly, sitting in the back pew, as if unconcerned. The pastor spoke about forgiveness. Not the kind offered to ease one's conscience, but the kind that comes from something greater, something beyond our own power. He quoted Jesus' words about loving even those who hurt us, about letting go of the pain and letting God heal our hearts. I found myself paying attention like I hadn't in a long time, and each phrase seemed to fit into my own silence. After the meeting ended, I sat still as people filed out. A man approached, placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "You are not alone. God knows exactly where you are and wants to heal you." I can't explain why, but in that instant something inside me broke. It wasn't anger. It was as if all the defenses I had built up had crumbled. I returned to my room, and for the first time in many years, I spoke to God. I spoke about my pain, my abandonment, what my children had done. But I also spoke about myself, my pride, my coldness. And in that simple prayer, I asked Jesus to come in and change what I couldn't change on my own. In the following days, something began to change. I still woke up early, I still walked the same quiet streets, but the weight on my shoulders was no longer the same. Every morning I felt as if someone were with me, guiding my steps, reminding me that I was no longer alone. I began reading the Bible they gave me at church, and on every page I found something that seemed to have been written just for me. The Holy Spirit began to show me that no matter how much I'd been hurt, holding on to that resentment was like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. And I realized that my plan to disappear was actually a way to stay trapped in what had hurt me. True freedom wasn't in disappearing. It was in forgiving. It was a process. It didn't happen overnight. I remembered the harsh words, the exclusions, and my heart still ached. But every time this pain came, I gave it to God. And little by little, the resentment gave way to a different desire, to return. Not to demand anything, not to demand an apology, but to prove that even when human love fails, God's love is enough to rebuild what seemed lost. And that's how I began to think of my family differently. Not as enemies, but as people as imperfect and graceless as I am. I decided to return without warning, not as someone who returns to demand something, but as someone who simply wants to accept and move on. I took an early bus alone with my suitcase and Bible. During the journey, I considered the reactions I might encounter. Perhaps coldness, perhaps surprise, perhaps even indifference. But I also knew that the outcome was no longer in my hands. Getting off in my village, I walked toward the old house. The door was just as I'd left it, but the tall grass and dust on the windows indicated it hadn't been cared for. Before I entered, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw Daniel standing there, a look of astonishment and guilt mixed with his own. For a few seconds, he couldn't say anything. Lucia appeared shortly after, holding back tears. There was no rehearsed speech. I just stepped forward and hugged them. They tried to apologize, their words tumbling out, but I simply said, "I already forgave you." They looked at me as if they didn't understand. So I added, "I found the one who taught me to love you, even when you forgot me." The silence that followed was no longer heavy, but filled with something new. For the first time in years, I felt like there was room to start over. We entered the house together. The smell of wood and old memories seemed different now. No longer the scent of abandonment, but that of a home ready to welcome life again. We sat on the porch like so many other times, but this time there were no demands or accusations. There was a pleasant silence, full of things that didn't need to be said. I told them about the day I heard that song coming out of church, how I walked in without knowing why and walked out with a renewed heart. I spoke of the forgiveness I received from Jesus, a forgiveness I didn't deserve, but one that set me free. I said that if he had done this for me, I had no right to deny it to my children. Daniel discreetly wiped his eyes. Lucia squeezed my hand tightly, as if afraid to let go again. At that moment I understood that the real turning point wasn't my disappearance, but my return with a love that came not from me, but from God. Since then, our relationship hasn't been perfect, but it's real. There are conversations, visits, shy laughs, and above all, hope. What my children didn't know, and now know, is that the greatest gift I can give them isn't property, money, or inheritances. It's showing them that even after so much abandonment, Jesus gives us the way back home, and to each other. And that's the part I want you to take away from my story. No matter how much you've been hurt, there is a love that can heal, restore, and rewrite the ending. I found that love in Jesus, and I hope you find it too. If you've listened to my story to the end, you already know it began with abandonment and pain, but ended with reunion and forgiveness. I discovered that no escape can heal a broken heart, only Jesus can. He filled the void that neither distance nor revenge nor silence could erase. Today I look back and realize that every step, even those that seemed to distance me from my family, was used by God to bring me back, different. I returned with a new heart, capable of embracing without demanding anything in return, of forgiving without holding on to loose ends, of loving without fear of being hurt again. This came not from my own strength, but from the Holy Spirit. Perhaps you're going through something similar. Perhaps you've been betrayed, forgotten, or scorned by those who should have cared for you. I want you to know that there is a path to restoration. No matter how deep the hole you've fallen into, God's hand is always longer. If this story touched you, if it touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Here you'll hear real stories of people who found hope when there seemed to be no way out. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Who knows, maybe the next story will be yours. Leave a comment. I want to know if you've ever experienced something you could only overcome with God's help. Your answer might inspire others listening now who need to believe that starting over is possible. I'm Ernesto, and this was my story. A story that didn't end in abandonment, but in the embrace God gave me, which I was able to return to my family. And may you never forget, no matter how dark it gets, Jesus is always the light that calls us home.